The neighbors froze as 2 limousines rolled to a stop in front of the old taco shack. Nancy Keller dropped the ladle in her hand, the metal clattering against the sidewalk. Everyone turned to stare as 2 tall men in suits stepped out, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, tears glinting under the morning sun. They didn't say a word at first. They just walked toward her, each holding a bouquet of white lilies. Nancy's lips trembled as she whispered the only words she could find, "My boys, you came back." Before we begin, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. Boise, Idaho. The kind of small American city where everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows who's struggling. Nancy Keller was one of those faces people saw every day but never really looked at. 50 years old, hair streaked gray before its time, and hands permanently rough from washing dishes, flipping tortillas, and hauling water jugs through the biting cold. For 20 years, she'd run the same little taco cart parked near the old bus terminal, a beat-up aluminum stand with faded stickers, hand-painted letters that once read, "Keller's Tacos, made with love." The sign had peeled long ago, but the love hadn't. Every morning, before the city truly woke, Nancy pushed her cart from her tiny rented room near 3rd Street to her usual corner. The wheels squeaked, and the smell of roasted chilies and warm tortillas filled the crisp Idaho air. Workers from the nearby construction site came for her breakfast tacos. Cheap, simple, and honest. She didn't make much, but she made enough to survive. Enough to buy flour, oil, beans, and occasionally, a small cup of coffee for herself at the end of the day. It wasn't the life she once imagined, but it was the one she built from the ashes. 15 years earlier, Nancy had been married to a kind man named Paul Keller, a carpenter who dreamed of opening a small diner with her. They had a modest home, plans, and hope. But one rainy evening, driving home from a late job, Paul's truck slid on black ice and never made it past the intersection on Franklin Road. 3 weeks later, the baby they'd prayed for, the one she carried 6 months along, was gone too. After the funeral, Nancy's world went silent. Her in-laws drifted away. Friends stopped calling. The bills kept coming. And so, out of necessity more than choice, she sold her wedding ring and bought a small second-hand food cart. At first, people pitied her, the widowed taco lady. But over time, they forgot. Boise moved on. Nancy stayed. She became part of the city's rhythm, dependable, quiet, invisible. Still, there was something about her that refused to harden. Even on slow days, she gave free tacos to the janitor from the post office, slipped a sandwich into the hands of a tired mother passing by, or left extra food outside the shelter steps after closing. "Kindness," she once said softly to herself, "is the only thing I can still afford to give." And that was the truth. It was late November when she first saw them. 2 boys, maybe 9 or 10, thin as fence posts, huddled behind her cart. It was cold that night, the kind of Idaho chill that made your bones ache. Nancy was closing up when she heard the soft rustling of paper bags. She turned, and there they were, 2 identical faces peeking out from behind a trash bin, small hands clutching pieces of stale tortilla. Her heart caught. She could tell instantly they were twins. They had the same messy brown hair, the same tired gray eyes, and the same hollow look of hunger she recognized too well, the look of a child who's been surviving instead of living. Nancy didn't speak at first. She simply knelt beside her cart, opened her pot of beans, and began to spoon warm food into 2 small paper cups. "Here," she said softly, placing them on the curb. The boys hesitated, glancing at each other. Then, slowly, they took the cups and ate, not with greed, but with quiet desperation. After a few minutes, one of them whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." She nodded. "You got names?" The older twin, by maybe a few minutes, wiped his mouth. "I'm Eli. He's Noah." "Where's your mom and dad?" she asked gently. The boys went silent. Eli lowered his eyes. "Gone." That was all he said. Nancy didn't press further. She just smiled sadly and said, "Then come back tomorrow, all right? You can help me clean up, earn a meal the right way." They nodded, eyes wide with something between disbelief and hope. The next morning, they were back, waiting even before she arrived. From then on, they became part of her little routine. Noah helped roll napkins. Eli cleaned the countertop. In return, she fed them fresh tortillas and warm beans, always sneaking an extra portion for later. Sometimes, she'd find them sleeping near the alley across the street. She never asked why. She just started leaving a blanket by the cart after closing. For the first time in years, Nancy didn't feel so alone. The boys brought laughter back into her quiet mornings. Noah had a habit of singing while stirring batter. Eli told silly stories that made her forget her pain. "Careful, you'll burn the tortillas," she'd tease. "Can't burn what's already on fire," Noah would grin. They reminded her of the son she never got to raise, and she treated them as her own. Soon, other vendors noticed. Some mocked her. "You'll go broke feeding street rats," one said. Nancy only smiled. "Then I'll go broke doing something good." She started saving small amounts each week in a glass jar labeled Twin Tacos. Her dream was to one day open a little stand where they could all work together. It was a simple dream, but it gave her purpose. Every night before heading home, she'd whisper a small prayer over the cart. "Lord, if I can't have my child, let me still be someone's mother." And in some quiet, unseen way, her prayer was answered. Because what started as one act of kindness would soon turn into something far greater, something that would come back to her in ways she could never imagine. Sometimes, the world forgets people like Nancy, the ones who give even when they have nothing left. But her story reminds us that love doesn't need money, it just needs heart. If stories like this make you believe that kindness still matters, take a moment to stay with us, not for the numbers, but for every Nancy out there who keeps giving quietly, hoping someone remembers. The following weeks blurred into a new kind of routine, one that filled the empty corners of Nancy Keller's days with laughter she hadn't heard in years. Every morning, before dawn painted the Boise sky pink, she would roll her taco cart to the corner of 3rd and Oak. By the time she'd heated the first pan of oil, 2 small shadows were already waiting near the lamppost, Eli and Noah. They were no longer the scared, starving boys she'd first met digging through her trash. Bit by bit, the color had returned to their faces, and so had something else, trust. Nancy had become their safe place. They'd show up in mismatched jackets, shoes too big for their feet, and smiles that could melt Idaho's winter frost. She'd hand them paper cups filled with warm beans and eggs, and in exchange, they'd help her serve the early morning crowd of bus drivers and construction workers. "Morning, Mama Nancy," Eli would say, his voice still raspy from the cold. "Morning, troublemakers," she'd tease back. The nickname stuck. The rhythm of belonging. By noon, the boys had found little ways to make the stand their own. Noah insisted on taking orders, even when he couldn't spell half the menu, while Eli handled money with a seriousness beyond his age. They brought jokes, energy, and a kind of light that drew customers in. The construction crew started tipping extra, saying that Taco Twins made their day. Some even brought old clothes for them. Others, however, were less kind. Paula Briggs, who ran the hot dog stand across the street, began whispering things loud enough for Nancy to hear. "Feeding strays again, Nancy?" she'd say. "No wonder you'll die broke." Nancy never replied. She'd learned long ago that kindness didn't need defending. But late at night, when she locked her cart and counted her small earnings, she sometimes wondered if Paula was right. Some nights she went to bed hungry because she'd given the last taco away. Still, she couldn't stop. Each time she saw the twins' tired eyes light up at a warm meal, she thought of her lost baby, and how she'd do anything for someone to have fed him if he'd lived. A fragile dream. By early spring, Nancy had saved $26 in the glass jar labeled Twin Tacos. It wasn't much, but to her it was proof that maybe, someday, she could give the boys something permanent. A small shop, a roof, stability. One chilly evening, while closing up, Noah asked, "Mama Nancy, do you think people like us can ever be rich?" Nancy smiled. "Rich doesn't mean big houses, sweetheart. It means you can sleep knowing you didn't hurt anyone today." Eli nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Then you're the richest person I know." She laughed softly, though tears burned the corners of her eyes. Whispers and worry. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood talk grew crueler. Some vendors claimed Nancy was exploiting the kids, making them work for food. Others accused her of stealing supplies from the community pantry. The city inspector showed up one morning, demanding new permits she couldn't afford. The landlord of her small rented room raised her rent. It was as if the world decided that goodness was too suspicious to be left alone. Still, the twins stayed by her side. They protected her cart from drunks, helped her pack up, and sang silly songs as they pushed it home each night. Then, one late autumn day, the inevitable happened. A social services van pulled up beside her stand. 2 officers stepped out, asking questions: who the boys were, where their guardians were, why they were working instead of attending school. Nancy's heart pounded as she tried to explain. "They're not working. They're just helping. I feed them, they have no one." The officers exchanged looks. "That's exactly the problem, ma'am." Within an hour, the twins were gone, taken to a foster facility for their safety. The last thing Nancy saw was Eli's face pressed against the van window, mouthing words she couldn't hear over the idling engine. That night, the corner of 3rd and Oak felt colder than it ever had. A lonely winter. In the weeks that followed, Nancy worked like a machine. She served tacos to people who didn't remember her name. Every sound, every laugh from a passing child, broke her heart anew. Her savings dwindled, and so did her health. She developed a cough that wouldn't leave. Some days she didn't bother to open the cart. Other days she forced herself to, just to keep the memory of the boys alive. The neighborhood forgot about them quickly. Only Nancy remembered the sound of their laughter echoing through that narrow street. Years pass, a quiet existence. Time, relentless as the Idaho wind, swept 20 years away before she realized it. Now in her late 60s, Nancy still ran the same old taco stand, though slower, with trembling hands and faded eyes. The city had changed, new apartments, new faces, but her corner remained. The twin tacos jar still sat on the shelf inside her tiny kitchen, covered in dust. Sometimes she'd hold it, tracing the cracked glass, wondering what had become of Eli and Noah. Did they remember her? Did they survive? Were they happy? Every Christmas, she'd wrap 2 small burritos in foil and leave them by the bus stop bench, whispering, in case they find their way back. The neighbors laughed behind her back. Poor old Nancy, still feeding ghosts. She didn't mind. She'd learned long ago that love wasn't about being repaid, it was about being remembered. And somewhere, in another part of the country, 2 men, no longer boys, were remembering her every single day. Eli and Noah had grown into strong, successful adults. After bouncing through foster homes and surviving on scholarships, they'd built a tech company that helped provide meals to low-income families. They called it Twin Hope Enterprises. Each year, on the anniversary of the day they'd met Nancy, they funded a food drive project in her name. But one thing haunted them: they'd never seen her again. They didn't even know if she was alive. Until one winter morning, while reviewing an outreach report from Boise, Noah froze. There, at the bottom of a list of small business donors, was a familiar name: Keller's Tacos, street vendor license number 2041. "She's alive," Noah whispered. Eli looked at him, stunned. After 20 years. That night, they booked flights home. 2 limousines waited at the airport. And by dawn, the same cracked street where Nancy once gave 2 starving boys their first warm meal would witness a scene the whole neighborhood would never forget. When life decides to test the kind-hearted, it never does it gently. For Nancy Keller, that test came wrapped in false smiles and whispered lies. By the time the twins were taken away, her spirit was already fragile. But she held on to hope like a thread, believing the boys would come back, that kindness could somehow win over systems, that good deeds couldn't end in silence. But life, especially for the gentle, rarely plays fair. After Eli and Noah disappeared into the foster system, Nancy's world began to shrink. Her customers thinned out. The vendors across the street stopped greeting her. The laughter that once spilled from her corner vanished. Even the city inspectors seemed to pass her by without recognition. It was as if she'd been erased. Still, Nancy kept showing up. Every morning, she pushed her cart to the same spot, unpacked her tortillas, and lit the little gas stove, waiting for the world to remember her again. The whispers begin. 6 months after the twins were taken, a rumor began to spread through the market, started as most poison does, by envy. Paula Briggs, the hot dog vendor across the street, had never liked Nancy. She'd mocked her kindness, sneered at her generosity, and despised the affection the community once had for her. Now, with the twins gone, Paula saw her chance to finish what envy had started. She used those boys, Paula whispered to a regular one morning. Fed them so people would pity her. Probably stole from that shelter to... You think she could afford all that food? By the end of the week, the whispers grew into full sentences. The next Monday, 2 city officers showed up at Nancy's cart. Ms. Keller, one said, reading from a clipboard, "We've received complaints about your business license and food safety. We're going to need to inspect your supplies." Nancy's hands trembled as they opened her cooler. Inside was nothing but beans, rice, eggs, and a few tortillas, the same simple ingredients she'd used for years. "There's nothing wrong here," she said softly. But they weren't looking for truth, only an excuse. They fined her for improper labeling and lack of a renewed permit. The amount? More than she made in 3 months. Nancy tried to appeal. She went to the city office with her papers, her receipts, her trembling voice. But bureaucracy has no ears for the poor. "You'll need to shut down until your file clears," they told her. Her cart sat empty for weeks. The lonely fight. The neighbors who once smiled began to look away. Paula's stand, meanwhile, grew busier. She'd moved into Nancy's old corner and even renamed her menu Twin Dogs, mocking the story that once warmed everyone's hearts. Nancy watched from a distance, clutching the old jar labeled Twin Tacos. Her savings were gone, her rent overdue. The small room she'd called home was now bare. She'd sold her television and heater to buy food. Some nights, she'd light a single candle by the window and whisper their names into the dark. "Eli. Noah." There was no answer. Only the hum of traffic, the world moving on without her. When kindness meets cruelty. One particularly cold evening, Nancy gathered the courage to reopen her cart, this time a few blocks away, near a laundromat. She figured she could rebuild quietly, one taco at a time. A handful of customers trickled in. A few remembered her cooking and smiled. For a moment, it felt like life was giving her another chance. But that's when the final blow came. A woman from the shelter arrived, clutching a newspaper article. It was about a new, charity project Paula Briggs had launched, feeding underprivileged children every weekend. She'd been praised as a local hero, her story almost identical to Nancy's, except rewritten, polished, and stolen. Paula had used Nancy's legacy, her bond with the twins, her reputation for compassion, to build her own success. The betrayal cut deeper than any loss. Nancy didn't confront her. She just packed her cart that night in silence. When she returned home, she found a notice pinned to her door, eviction. She sat on the floor of her empty room, the jar of Twin Tacos clutched to her chest. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. After years of giving, she had nothing left to give, not even sorrow. The disappearance. The next morning, the taco cart was gone. No one saw Nancy leave. Some said she moved in with a distant cousin. Others claimed she was taken to a church shelter downtown. A few believed she died quietly in her sleep. But in truth, she hadn't gone far. She'd found refuge behind an old church on the city's east side. The pastor allowed her to set up a small stand by the steps. It wasn't much, just a folding table, a pan, and an old sign that still read Keller's Tacos. Few customers came, but she didn't mind. It wasn't about the money anymore. She kept working out of habit and hope. Every evening before she closed, she'd prepare 2 small burritos and place them on the church bench. Sometimes birds would eat them. Other times they'd stay untouched. "Just in case," she'd whisper. And every December, she'd take her meager savings and donate them to the local children's center, anonymously, always signed the same way. From Mama Nancy. The quiet years. Time stretched on. Her body weakened. Her hands shook from arthritis, and her eyesight blurred from exhaustion. But she kept her routine, feed others, pray for the twins, and survive. And then, one quiet morning, 20 long years after the boys were taken, Nancy's life circled back to where it began. It started with the sound of engines rumbling down the narrow street. Not the rattle of delivery trucks she was used to, but something deeper, heavier. She looked up, squinting under the sun. Two black limousines rolled slowly past the church gates and stopped right in front of her home, a small shack made from scrap wood beside the fence. The air went still. Her hand froze mid-stir, the spoon trembling over the pan. For a second, she thought she was dreaming. Then, as the doors opened, two tall men stepped out, suits sharp, eyes familiar, and hearts breaking all over again. Eli, Noah, her boys. And this time, they hadn't come for food. They'd come to bring her home. The street had gone completely silent. Children stopped playing. The grocery clerk froze with a bag of apples midair. Even the pigeons seemed to pause as the two black limousines idled in front of the small church. Nancy Keller stood frozen behind her cart, her wrinkled hands still gripping the handle of the pan. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it echo in her chest. For a moment she thought it was a mistake, that someone else lived in the little shack beside the church, not her. But when the two tall men stepped out, she knew. Even after 20 years, she'd know those faces anywhere. Eli and Noah, the orphan twins she had once fed, sheltered, and loved like her own sons. Only now they weren't children anymore. Their shoulders were broad, their suits crisp and expensive, and their eyes, those same gray eyes, were filled with tears that no money could hide. The return. Nancy dropped the ladle. It clattered to the ground, splattering sauce onto her worn shoes. The sound startled her out of her trance. For a second, she wanted to run, not out of fear, but disbelief. Her voice trembled as she whispered, Noah? Both men froze. And then, as if 20 years had collapsed into one breath, they crossed the distance between them. Noah reached her first, dropping to his knees on the cracked sidewalk. Eli followed, wrapping his arms around her frail frame. Mama Nancy! She felt their tears soak her apron. Her shaking hands found their faces, tracing the lines time had carved. They were real, grown men now, but still her boys. Nancy's knees gave out. The twins held her up. Around them, curious neighbors watched in stunned silence. All those years of being forgotten, ignored, and discarded, and suddenly, the whole street was witnessing her story unfold. The reunion. Minutes passed before anyone spoke. It was Noah who finally broke the silence. We've been looking for you for years, he said, voice thick with emotion. Every Christmas, every birthday, we searched. Nancy's lips quivered. You're alive. You made it. Eli smiled faintly, brushing a tear from her cheek. We didn't just make it, Mama. You saved us, long before you ever knew. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and frayed. Nancy gasped when she saw it. It was the old drawing the twins had made the night before they were taken away, 3 stick figures holding tacos under a smiling sun. I kept it, Eli whispered. Through every foster home, every night we went hungry, this was what kept us going. Nancy clutched it to her chest. Her hands shook uncontrollably, but her smile was steady. The sight of them, alive, strong, successful, felt like sunlight warming a heart long left in winter. The story untold. They spent hours sitting on the church steps, catching up between tears and laughter. The twins told her everything, how they were split between foster homes, shuffled from one cold bed to another, until a kind social worker helped them get scholarships. Eli had gone into engineering. Noah had studied computer science. Together, they'd started a small tech firm from their college dorm called Twin Hope, inspired by her kindness. The business grew, and so did their mission. For every product they sold, they'd donate meals to homeless children, in honor of the woman who fed us first. Every detail left Nancy speechless. She never imagined the small kindness of feeding 2 boys would ripple across states, changing lives she'd never meet. You named your company after me? She asked softly. Noah grinned. We named it after hope. And you were Hope, Mom. You just didn't know it. Nancy wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. I never had much, she said quietly, but I gave you what I could. Eli leaned forward. And that was everything. A small act remembered. As they talked, Nancy's neighbors began gathering nearby, people who'd ignored her for years, whispering behind her back about the crazy taco lady. Now they stared in disbelief as two wealthy men knelt before her, their sleek cars gleaming under the winter sun. Paula Briggs, the hot dog vendor who'd mocked her decades ago, stood frozen in the crowd, jaw tight. She watched as Eli turned to Nancy and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We wouldn't be alive today without you. Everything we are, everything we built, it started with your tacos, Mama Nancy." Tears welled in Paula's eyes. For the first time, she lowered her gaze. It was as though the universe had drawn a full circle around every cruel word, every unfair rumor, and silenced them all with truth. Forgive. Eli motioned to the limousines. "We didn't just come to visit," he said gently. "We came to take you home." Nancy frowned. "Home?" Noah smiled. "Your real home. You've given enough to this world. Now let us take care of you." They guided her toward the cars. Inside, a small team of assistants waited, holding flowers, food baskets, and something wrapped in golden paper. When she unwrapped it, Nancy's breath caught in her throat. It was a framed document, the deed to a new restaurant building, freshly renovated, titled Twin Tacos Cafe, founded by Nancy Keller. She pressed her hand against the glass, her eyes wide. Eli said softly, "It's yours. The business. The name. Everything. We just put in what you already started." Nancy's lips trembled. For the first time in decades, she didn't have to be strong. She could simply be loved. Redemption in motion. They drove her across town to the cafe, a bright, warm space with yellow walls and the smell of fresh tortillas. On the counter hung a photograph of Nancy, smiling beside her old cart, and a plaque that read, "In honor of Mama Nancy, who taught us that kindness feeds more than hunger." When she saw it, she broke down completely. The years of loneliness, loss, and quiet giving, all the pain she'd endured without complaint, finally found their purpose. In that moment, Nancy understood that her suffering hadn't been forgotten. It had been growing, quietly, into something beautiful. The circle was complete. Epilogue tone. As the cafe opened that evening, Nancy insisted on cooking the first batch of tacos herself. The twins laughed as she scolded them for stirring the sauce wrong, just like old times. Outside, a line formed around the block. People from every corner of Boise coming to meet the woman whose kindness had built an empire. She looked through the window and whispered, "I told you, Paul. I told you our food would feed the world." For days after that morning, the whole of Boise couldn't stop talking about it. The story of two wealthy men who drove into the poorest part of town, stepped out of black limousines, and carried their old street food mother home. People who had once walked past Nancy Keller without a glance suddenly saw her everywhere. On the news, on social media, even on the front page of the Boise Chronicle. Street vendors' kindness returns after 20 years. Twin brothers build empire to honor her. But for Nancy, none of that mattered. She didn't care for headlines or praise. All she wanted was what she'd prayed for every night since that cold winter 20 years ago, to see her boys again, safe, smiling, and full. A new beginning. Nancy now lived in a small cottage behind the new Twin Tacos Cafe. Every morning, she'd wake to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Eli and Noah arguing in the kitchen like kids again. The cafe had become the heart of the city, not because of its success, but because of its story. People lined up not just for food, but to meet the woman who had taught two orphans how to love before the world taught them how to live. Nancy didn't see herself as a hero. She still wore the same old apron, her hands still trembling as she kneaded dough. The twins tried to convince her to rest, but she'd always laugh. "I'm not resting until I see every hungry child in this town fed," she'd say. That was Nancy, humble, steady, unshaken by fame. The full circle moment. One quiet afternoon, the cafe hosted its grand community event, free meals for anyone in need. The line stretched down the block. Factory workers, single mothers, veterans, and children who reminded Nancy of Eli and Noah all those years ago. She served each person with the same warmth she'd always had. No cameras, no speeches, just kindness. When Paula Briggs, the former hot dog vendor, appeared in the line. Nancy's heart tightened. The woman looked older now, weary, her eyes dim with regret. She stood there, clutching her purse nervously. Nancy stepped forward and handed her a plate. Paula whispered, "You should hate me. After everything I said about you, after what I did." Nancy smiled softly. "If I hate you, Paula, I'd lose the very thing that saved me. Take the food. Be well." Tears rolled down Paula's cheeks. She took the plate, whispering, "I'm sorry." Nancy nodded. "You're forgiven." In that moment, even the air in the cafe seemed to change. For the first time, people saw not just a woman who had suffered, but one who had chosen grace when the world offered bitterness. Legacy of kindness. As the day went on, Nancy sat near the window, watching families laugh over plates of tacos and soup. A small girl approached her, holding a napkin with a hand-drawn picture on it, 3 stick figures under a sun. Nancy's breath caught. It was just like the drawing Eli and Noah had made years ago. The little girl smiled shyly. "Mama Nancy, my mom said you feed everyone. I made you this." Nancy took it with trembling hands. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll keep it forever." Later that night, when the cafe closed and the lights dimmed, she hung the napkin next to the original drawing, side by side, one from the past, one from the present. Beneath them, she wrote in simple letters, "Feed with love. It always finds its way home." The twins' revelation. Months later, during an anniversary event for Twin Hope, Eli took the stage with Noah by his side. Hundreds of guests filled the hall, cameras flashing, applause echoing. When the crowd quieted, Eli said, "There's someone here tonight who doesn't think she belongs on this stage. But if it weren't for her, none of us would be standing here. She taught us what real wealth is, not money, not power, but kindness." He turned to the side and gestured toward the front row. Nancy, dressed in her simple floral dress, looked down in disbelief as the spotlight found her. The audience rose to their feet. The applause lasted for minutes. Noah spoke next. "We were 2 hungry kids digging through trash. She could have ignored us, but she didn't. She gave us food, warmth, and a mother's heart. And for 20 years, that memory built everything we've become." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. She had spent a lifetime being invisible, and now the whole room saw her. She didn't say much when they handed her the microphone, only this. "I didn't save anyone. I just shared what little I had. If you have something, a meal, a smile, a hand, give it. You never know how far it will go." The crowd went silent. Then they stood again, not for the business, not for the success, but for the truth of her words. Poetic justice. Later that night, as Nancy walked outside with the twins, she looked up at the city skyline, glowing lights, moving cars, the hum of life. "This world can be cruel," she said softly, "but it can also surprise you. The love you give doesn't disappear. It just takes the long way home." Eli took her hand. "And we're home now, Mama." They stood there under the Boise night sky, the same city that had once ignored her, now shining because of her legacy. Sometimes, the people who seem to have the least are the ones who give the most. Nancy Keller didn't change the world with wealth or power. She changed it with a warm taco, a kind word, and a heart that never stopped believing that love comes back. Because kindness, real, quiet kindness, never goes unnoticed forever. And if you're still here watching the story until the very end, maybe that means you believe in kindness too. Maybe you've been a Nancy once, giving without being seen. Or maybe someone once fed you when you were hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food. If stories like this remind you that good people still exist, don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but for the reminder that humanity is still alive somewhere between the hurt and the hope. Because sometimes one story is all it takes to feed a soul. Nancy Keller's story isn't about tacos or money. It's about the quiet power of giving when no one's watching, and how love, no matter how small, always finds its way back home. So the next time you see someone hungry, lost, or forgotten, remember Mama Nancy. Because she proved that a full heart can feed the world.